The unexpected call. The first sound was a soft phone ring breaking the quiet night. Sandra sat on the edge of her small apartment bed, staring at the city lights outside her window. She had been feeling lost for weeks, juggling 2 jobs after her father's passing and trying to hold her little family together. Her mother, Clara, was getting weaker, and the bills were growing taller. When the phone rang again, Sandra felt her chest tighten. She answered, expecting more hospital paperwork or another debt reminder. But it was her mother's trembling voice, barely a whisper. "Sweetheart, I called him," Clara said. "Called who, Mom?" Sandra's voice was sharp but tired. The clock blinked 11:54 p.m., the city hum outside mixing with her shallow breath. "Keanu," her mother said quietly. The name landed like a stone in still water. Sandra froze, her mind flipping through memories of her late father's favorite movies. Keanu Reeves wasn't just a movie star to their family. He was a memory of Sunday afternoons, popcorn, and laughter when times were simple. Clara's voice cracked. "I remembered. Years ago, your dad met him on a film set. He said Keanu was kind. That he gave him a number once, said if we ever needed help." She paused, coughing softly. I didn't know what else to do." Sandra's first reaction was disbelief mixed with anger. The world didn't work like that. People didn't pick up old numbers and show up for strangers. But beneath her frustration was a flicker of something she had not felt in weeks. Hope. She wanted to yell, to tell her mom not to expect miracles. But Clara's fragile tone stopped her. "I couldn't stand watching you carry all this alone," Clara whispered. "Maybe kindness still exists." The next morning, Sandra tried to bury the thought. She went to work at the coffee shop, her apron tied too tight and her eyes heavy from lack of sleep. Outside, rain painted the sidewalks silver. Customers came and went, their faces blurred by her exhaustion. Around noon, the door opened, and a tall man in a plain black jacket stepped inside. He removed his hood, water dripping from his dark hair, and for a moment, the room seemed to slow down. His presence was calm, almost gentle. Sandra looked up from behind the counter and felt her breath catch. It was Keanu Reeves. He gave her a small nod and walked toward her as if they had known each other forever. There was no camera crew, no entourage, no flashing lights, just a quiet man who looked at her with the kind of eyes that saw beyond walls. "You must be Sandra," he said softly, his voice steady but warm. "Your mother called." Sandra's hands trembled. Her co-workers exchanged confused glances, but Keanu ignored the curious stares around them. I can't believe you're here," she managed to say. Her voice cracked like glass. "Why would you even—" "Because someone asked for help," he interrupted gently. "And sometimes that's enough." He didn't make a show of it. He didn't pull out a wallet or promise grand gestures. Instead, he ordered a black coffee and sat down at a corner table. After her shift ended, he waited for her outside under the awning, rain still falling like a quiet curtain around them. The streetlights flickered and car tires hissed on wet pavement. They stood there, 2 strangers bound by a single phone call. "I don't know what my mom told you," Sandra said finally, her voice low. "But we're not asking for charity." Keanu's lips curved into the faintest smile. "She didn't ask for charity," he replied. "She asked for someone to remind you you're not alone." The words hit her harder than she expected. Sandra felt her defenses crumble, the weight of nights spent crying alone pressing against her ribs. For a moment, the city noise faded, and all she could hear was her own heartbeat. She didn't notice the old man struggling with a heavy box near the curb until Keanu stepped forward without hesitation, lifted the box with ease, and carried it to the man's car. No cameras, no applause. Just quiet kindness. Sandra watched him, stunned. He wasn't a star here, he was simply human. And for the first time in weeks, she felt the air lighten around her. As they walked toward her small apartment to meet her mother, Sandra sensed something shifting. It wasn't about fame or fortune. It was about the simple, almost forgotten truth that people could still choose to be good. Inside the apartment, Clara's frail frame seemed even smaller against the dim lamplight. When Keanu entered, she struggled to sit up, her thin hands trembling. "You came," she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. Keanu knelt beside her chair, took her hand gently, and said, "A promise made to your husband deserves to be kept." Sandra stood frozen, tears threatening. The room felt charged, as if years of grief and struggle had been waiting for this moment. Keanu didn't promise miracles or money. He promised presence. And sometimes that was more powerful than anything else. As the night deepened, the three of them talked quietly, about memories, about loss, about little things that mattered. Outside, the city kept moving, unaware that in a tiny apartment, one act of kindness was quietly changing a family's story. The next morning, Sandra woke to the smell of coffee drifting through the apartment. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. Her mother's cough echoed softly from the bedroom, but there was another sound. Low laughter. Sandra stepped quietly into the kitchen, her bare feet cold against the tile. Keanu was there, sleeves rolled up, rinsing mugs in their chipped sink as if he had always belonged. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, catching the steam from the coffee pot like a small halo. He turned, smiled, and said, "Hope you don't mind. Your mom insisted I stay until you woke up." It should have felt strange, but instead, it felt safe. Sandra stood there, heart pounding, remembering the years when mornings were filled with her father's quiet hum as he cooked breakfast. A sudden wave of grief hit her, sharp and unexpected. Keanu noticed, drying his hands slowly. "Grief has a way of sneaking in when the world seems gentle," he said softly. His words weren't rehearsed. They felt real, and they held a weight that pulled her closer to listening. Later that day, Keanu suggested a walk to clear their heads. Clara agreed, urging her daughter to go. The streets were still damp from the rain, puddles catching fragments of sky. As they passed the small park near their building, they saw a boy trying to fix the chain on a rusted bicycle. Without hesitation, Keanu knelt beside him, guiding the chain back onto the gear. Sandra watched the boy's face light up in surprise. The boy's mother appeared breathless, thanking him. "It's nothing," he replied with a small nod. But the look on the woman's face said it was everything. As they walked on, Sandra finally asked, "Why do you keep doing things like that? Helping people who won't even know your name?" Keanu's gaze stayed on the ground ahead. "Because years ago, someone did the same for me," he said quietly. There was a heaviness in his voice that made her curious. But he didn't elaborate. Instead, he stopped near a busker playing a violin under a flickering street lamp. The tune was sad but beautiful, and for a moment they stood in silence, listening. When the song ended, Keanu placed a folded bill into the man's worn case, but he didn't walk away. He asked the man's name, shook his hand, and wished him a good day. It wasn't the money. It was the respect that seemed to matter. Back at the apartment, Clara was sitting by the window, a faded photograph of her late husband in her lap. Keanu joined her, and they spoke in low voices. Sandra couldn't quite hear. She saw her mother's eyes glisten, then watched as Keanu reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, weathered envelope. He placed it on the table. "Your husband gave me this years ago," he said. "He told me to keep it safe until the right moment." Clara's hands shook as she opened it, revealing a single note written in her late husband's handwriting. "If life ever feels too heavy, remember kindness can lift anything." Clara pressed the paper to her chest, tears sliding down her cheeks. Sandra felt her throat tighten. "Why did you keep that all this time?" she whispered. Keanu's eyes softened. "Because your father believed in people more than anything. He told me once that if I could help someone someday, even in a small way, it would mean I hadn't forgotten what mattered." That night, Sandra sat awake long after her mother had fallen asleep. Outside, the city's distant sirens and honking cars felt less intrusive, as though the world had softened around the edges. She replayed the day in her mind, the boy with the bicycle, the busker, the envelope. She thought about her own fear of asking for help, her pride, her exhaustion. She realized that sometimes strength wasn't about holding everything alone. It was about letting others stand with you. A soft knock at the door startled her. When she opened it, she found an elderly neighbor from down the hall, Mrs. Dalton, holding a broken lamp. "Sorry to bother you," the woman said nervously. "I saw a man here earlier, tall, kind eyes. Is he still around? I didn't want to impose, but my lamp fell and I can't fix it." Before Sandra could respond, Keanu appeared behind her, still awake, holding a mug of tea. "Let's take a look," he said warmly. Within minutes, he had the lamp fixed. Mrs. Dalton's smile was small, but full of relief. As she left, Sandra noticed how these little moments seemed to ripple outward, small acts creating quiet waves. As the hours crept toward dawn, Sandra and Keanu found themselves talking on the small balcony, the city lights flickering like distant stars. He shared stories, not of Hollywood, but of quiet nights riding the subway alone, of strangers who once shared their last umbrella, of an old friend who had saved him from despair when he thought no one cared. Sandra listened, realizing how deeply human he was beneath the fame. He wasn't saving them with grand gestures. He was reminding them what kindness looked like when the world had forgotten. Just before the sky turned pale, Sandra confessed something she hadn't said aloud in months. "Sometimes I feel invisible," she whispered. "Like no matter how hard I work, no one sees the struggle." Keanu didn't respond with advice or pity. He simply placed his hand gently on hers and said, "I see you." The simplicity of the words broke something open inside her. Tears rolled down her face silently, but for the first time, they didn't feel like a sign of weakness. They felt like release. As the first birds began to sing outside, Sandra realized the weight on her chest had shifted. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. There were still bills, still uncertainty. But there was also a quiet proof standing beside her in the early light, that one person's presence could change everything. And somewhere in that fragile dawn, hope, once small and forgotten, began to bloom again. The day after their fragile dawn, the city seemed louder and brighter, as if the world itself had shifted overnight. Sandra woke to her mother humming softly in the kitchen, something she hadn't done in months. It was a small, hopeful sound that almost made Sandra cry. Keanu was already dressed, tying his worn boots by the door. He looked up with that calm, steady gaze that had begun to feel like an anchor in the storm. "I was thinking," he said quietly, "your mom deserves a day outside. Just somewhere small. Fresh air helps." Sandra hesitated. Her mother's health was fragile, but the thought of Clara smiling outside instead of under the yellowed apartment light was tempting. They bundled her in a soft shawl, and Keanu hailed a cab. As they drove through the city, rain clouds drifted apart, revealing a sky brushed with pale blue. Clara pressed her hand to the window, whispering, "It feels like the world remembers us today." The cab stopped at a small botanical garden on the edge of the city. There were few visitors, only birdsong and the sound of water trickling through hidden fountains. Keanu guided Clara to a bench shaded by flowering trees. The air smelled of wet earth and jasmine. Sandra sat beside them, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease. For a while, they said nothing, just watched the wind sway the blossoms. Suddenly, a commotion broke the quiet. A teenage girl tripped near the fountain, her bag spilling across the path. Books and sketches scattered like leaves. Before Sandra could move, Keanu was already there, kneeling, gathering the papers with careful hands. The girl looked up, startled to see him. Her breath caught, and for a moment she seemed to forget her scraped knee. "Thank you," she whispered, embarrassed. Her sketchbook was open, revealing delicate pencil drawings of faces, some joyful, some sorrowful. Keanu glanced at them, then back at her. "These are beautiful," he said gently. "Don't hide them." The girl blushed, muttered a shy thanks, and hurried away, but Sandra noticed her shoulders seemed lighter as she left. Later, as they wandered deeper into the garden, Clara began to tire. They found a quiet tea kiosk run by an elderly man with bright, curious eyes. While waiting for tea, a sudden tremor of anxiety swept over Sandra, an instinct she couldn't explain. She glanced toward a narrow bridge nearby and saw a small child leaning too far over the railing, reaching for a paper boat floating below. Before she could shout, the boy slipped, his small body tilting dangerously over the edge. The world seemed to slow. Keanu dropped his tea without hesitation and sprinted toward the bridge. With one quick motion, he grabbed the boy's jacket just as his feet lost the rail. The boy gasped, dangling for a second before Keanu lifted him back onto safe ground. The child's mother came running, her sobs echoing across the water. "Thank you!" she cried, clutching her son. Keanu only nodded, crouching to meet the boy's frightened eyes. "Boats are easier to save than people," he said softly. The boy sniffled, managing a small smile. The garden's quiet returned, but Sandra felt the echo of that moment pulsing through her chest. She realized how quickly life could shift, how fragile the line between ordinary and tragedy could be. Clara reached for Sandra's hand, her voice trembling. "Your father would have liked him," she whispered. On the way back, the cab passed a mural painted on a brick wall, a vibrant scene of people helping one another, a man lifting debris after a storm, a woman handing food to a stranger. Keanu glanced at it, his jaw tightening slightly. "Art like that," he murmured, "reminds us of what we're capable of. But sometimes the world forgets." There was a weight in his words that Sandra didn't fully understand. She sensed there was more to his story, something unspoken. That evening, Sandra invited Keanu to stay for dinner. The apartment smelled of garlic and rosemary as Clara cooked a simple meal. They ate together, laughter breaking through the heaviness that had clung to the family for so long. After dinner, Keanu offered to wash the dishes. Sandra joined him at the sink, their hands brushing occasionally as they rinsed plates. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was warm, like a shared secret. When Clara excused herself to rest, Sandra and Keanu stepped onto the balcony again. The city lights shimmered below like scattered diamonds. A distant siren wailed, then faded. Keanu leaned on the railing, his profile etched against the night sky. "You know," he began, "fame teaches you strange things. People see you on a screen and forget you're just as breakable as anyone else." His voice was low, almost lost in the breeze. "I've had nights where I thought no one would notice if I disappeared. But once, a stranger's kindness saved me. That's why I try to pass it forward." Sandra felt her throat tighten. She wanted to ask who the stranger was, what had happened, but she sensed the details didn't matter. What mattered was the way he said it, with raw honesty that left no room for pretense. She placed her hand on the railing near his, close enough to feel the warmth of his skin. "You don't have to carry the whole world," she whispered. Keanu turned, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes, something fragile and human beneath the calm exterior. "Neither do you," he replied. The city below them seemed quieter, as if holding its breath. Then, as if on cue, Sandra's phone buzzed. The hospital's name flashed on the screen. Her heart sank. She answered, her voice shaking. A nurse informed her that an error had occurred with her mother's medication order. The next refill wasn't available for 3 days, and switching brands could be risky. Panic surged through her. Without hesitation, Keanu gently took the phone, spoke calmly to the nurse, and asked for the pharmacy's location. Within an hour, they were walking under flickering streetlights, searching for a late-night pharmacy across town. The sidewalks were nearly empty, the city wearing its quiet midnight mask. Along the way, a homeless man sitting on cardboard called out softly, asking for spare change. Keanu crouched, spoke to him quietly, and handed him not just money, but his own scarf. As they walked on, Sandra felt the weight of every choice, every small kindness ripple outward. When they finally returned with the medicine, Clara was asleep, her breathing slow and steady. Sandra stood in the doorway, watching her mother's chest rise and fall. Keanu placed the small bag of pills on the table and whispered, "She's safe now." Sandra looked at him, tears brimming, realizing that safety wasn't just about medicine. It was about moments like this, when someone showed up without being asked twice. As dawn approached again, Sandra couldn't shake the feeling that Keanu's presence was more than coincidence. It felt like a thread, connecting her father's past kindness, her mother's desperate call, and this man who carried quiet strength wherever he went. Outside, the first light of morning touched the rooftops, and for the first time in a long while, Sandra believed that even in a world full of noise and struggle, kindness could still guide people home. The next day dawned gray and restless, clouds heavy like secrets waiting to spill. Sandra woke to the sound of soft rain against the window and the faint smell of coffee brewing. Keanu was at the kitchen table, sketching something on a napkin. His hair was still damp from the shower, and his expression was deep in thought. When he noticed her watching, he smiled faintly. "Just a small idea," he said. "Your father once talked about a community space, somewhere people could meet, share music, help each other. Maybe it's time someone tries to make that real." The idea startled Sandra. She had forgotten those late-night talks her father once had about lifting the neighborhood. Before she could respond, Clara shuffled into the room with her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Though she looked tired, there was a spark in her eyes Sandra hadn't seen in months. "I heard the rain," she said quietly. "It feels like your father's voice out there." Her words carried a fragile hope that clung to the air. Keanu set down his pen, his gaze softening. "Sometimes the world speaks through small things," he said. By late morning, the rain had eased into a drizzle. Sandra suggested a short visit to the small bookstore her father had loved, the one on Elm Street with the crooked sign and mismatched chairs. Clara agreed, and Keanu offered to drive. As they stepped inside, the familiar scent of paper and old wood surrounded them. The shopkeeper, an elderly man named Mr. Geller, greeted them warmly, though his eyes flickered with recognition at the sight of Keanu. He said nothing, only nodded respectfully as if understanding that fame didn't belong here. While Clara wandered through the poetry section, Sandra noticed a display of old letters framed on the wall, notes from strangers thanking the shop for offering free books during tough times. Her father's handwriting was among them. She touched the glass, her throat tightening. Keanu joined her, reading the words silently. "He believed in small acts," Keanu whispered. "Those are the ones that change the world when no one's looking." Their quiet moment was interrupted by raised voices at the front of the store. A young man and woman stood near the counter arguing. The woman clutched a thin wallet, tears streaking her face. "I can't pay the rent if you keep wasting what little we have," she snapped. The man looked angry but desperate. Before the argument could escalate, Keanu approached calmly. "Hey," he said softly, not as a star, but as a person. "This place is about stories, about listening. Maybe hear each other before the world hears you." The couple froze, startled by his gentle tone. Sandra watched as their anger melted into quiet embarrassment. They left holding hands, their argument forgotten, at least for now. Later, as they left the bookstore, a gust of wind snatched one of Clara's shawl ends, sending it flying toward a deep puddle. Before it could touch the water, Keanu caught it, his reflexes swift. Clara laughed, a light ringing sound Sandra hadn't heard in too long. "Your father once did the same thing," she said, her voice warm. "He said small rescues matter." As evening approached, they stopped by a small diner for dinner. The neon sign flickered and the booths were filled with quiet conversations. They chose a corner seat. While waiting for food, Keanu excused himself briefly, and Sandra watched him approach a lonely man at the counter who seemed lost in thought. Keanu spoke to him for a moment, then returned. When he sat back down, Sandra asked, "You didn't even know him. Why?" Keanu shrugged lightly. "Sometimes all someone needs is to be seen." Halfway through their meal, the diner's door burst open. A young delivery driver stood in the doorway, soaked from the rain, clutching his chest. I think I'm going to pass out," he gasped, collapsing to the floor. The room erupted in shouts. Without hesitation, Keanu and Sandra rushed forward. Keanu checked the man's breathing while Sandra called for an ambulance. Clara, surprisingly steady, brought water and tried to comfort the frightened onlookers. Keanu kept the man calm, holding his hand, whispering that help was on the way. When the paramedics arrived, one of them quietly thanked Keanu, recognizing him but choosing not to make a scene. The man was stabilized, and the diner slowly returned to normal. Afterward, Sandra sat back at their booth, her hands trembling. "What are the chances?" she whispered. Keanu looked out the window at the rain-slicked street. "Sometimes the world gives you moments," he said. "Moments to show who you really are." On their drive home, they passed a darkened community center with broken windows. Keanu slowed the car. "This was the place your father once mentioned," he said quietly. Sandra looked at the crumbling building, memories flooding back of her father's dream. She could almost hear his voice. "A place where kindness isn't an event, it's the rule." Keanu parked, and for a moment they all sat in silence, staring at the abandoned building. Then Keanu said, "Maybe it doesn't have to stay broken." Back at the apartment, Clara was tired but peaceful. She kissed Sandra's forehead before heading to bed. Sandra and Keanu lingered in the living room, the city lights casting soft patterns on the walls. Keanu pulled the old napkin from his pocket, the one with the rough sketch of the community space. "I don't know where this will go," he said, "but maybe we can do something. Even small steps." Sandra felt a stirring of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel. Purpose. "My dad used to say that even the smallest steps leave footprints," she whispered. They stayed up late, planning nothing specific, yet everything at once. Ideas for music nights, food drives, reading corners. The plans were fragile but alive. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening under the city lights. Sandra looked at Keanu, realizing that his presence wasn't just changing their days, it was stitching broken pieces of their lives back together, thread by quiet thread. As the clock crept past midnight, a distant siren wailed, then faded. Sandra felt the weight of the world again, but it no longer felt unbearable. She glanced at Keanu, who was now gazing out the window, and thought of the countless people he had quietly touched that day. The girl with the sketches, the young couple, the delivery driver, the homeless man. She wondered how many lives could change if everyone chose even one small act of kindness. In that silent, tender moment, she knew tomorrow would bring more challenges, more bills, more fears, but also more chances to choose kindness. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The morning after their late-night planning felt strangely electric, as if the air itself carried a quiet promise. Sunlight slipped through the blinds, turning the apartment walls into soft gold. Sandra woke with a sense of nervous excitement she hadn't felt in years. Keanu was already awake, sitting on the balcony with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. He handed one to her without a word, his eyes scanning the skyline as if searching for something unseen. "I kept thinking about that broken community center," he said finally. "Places like that, they don't just hold walls. They hold memories and futures." Sandra took a sip, the warmth of the mug grounding her. She imagined the old building alive again, children's laughter, music spilling into the street, neighbors sharing food. The image was almost too hopeful, but she let herself hold it for a moment. Clara joined them, her shawl wrapped tight, a faint smile on her face. "Your father would be teasing us right now," she said, her voice soft. "He'd say, 'Dreams are good, but someone has to sweep the floor first.'" They laughed together, and for a heartbeat, it felt like he was still with them. Later that day, they visited the community center. The building's paint was chipped, windows cracked, and weeds tangled in the front steps. Inside, dust floated through beams of light like forgotten stars. Sandra ran her fingers along a faded mural of children holding hands. "He painted part of this," she whispered, remembering the nights her father had spent volunteering here. Keanu stood in the center of the room, hands in his pockets, turning slowly. "It's broken," he said quietly. "But it's not beyond saving." A sudden sound startled them, a shuffle of footsteps from a back hallway. An older janitor wearing a worn cap emerged holding a broom. His eyes widened when he recognized Keanu, but instead of fanfare, he simply said, "Didn't expect anyone to care about this place anymore." Keanu smiled faintly. "Places like this matter," he replied. "We just have to remind people." The janitor, whose name was Frank, shared stories of the center's past. Children learning music, neighbors gathering during storms, and volunteers who once turned this dusty hall into a lifeline for the community. His voice trembled when he admitted he still came by, sweeping even though no one paid him because some things deserve to be remembered. Sandra felt tears prick her eyes. They spent hours cleaning the main hall, stacking broken chairs, and sweeping the floor. Sandra's arms ached, but the ache felt good, like proof of purpose. When Keanu lifted a heavy table alone, Frank stopped him. "You don't have to do all this," Frank said quietly. Keanu paused, then replied, "If we wait for someone else to start, nothing changes." As evening settled, they sat on the dusty floor, tired but content. Clara, resting on a chair by the door, watched them with pride. "This is how it begins," she whispered. Not with grand speeches, but with hands willing to work. The next day, Sandra and Keanu visited local shops, sharing their vision for reopening the center. Some shop owners were skeptical, but a few offered small donations or supplies. A baker promised bread for events. A retired teacher offered to teach art classes for free. Each promise felt like a spark in the dark. On their way home, a sudden shout stopped them. Across the street, a cyclist had been hit by a car. The driver panicked, frozen in shock. Without hesitation, Keanu ran into the street, kneeling beside the cyclist, checking his breathing. Sandra dialed for help, her hands shaking. A small crowd gathered, murmuring, but no one else moved closer. Keanu's calm voice guided the injured man to stay conscious until the ambulance arrived. When the paramedics took over, the driver began to cry quietly. Keanu placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Accidents happen," he said softly. "What matters is what you do next." That night, as Sandra sat by the window, she thought about how quickly chaos could find people and how quietly kindness could mend it. Keanu joined her, carrying 2 mugs of tea. "You handled that well," she said. He shook his head. "You called for help. I just knelt down." Then he added, "But kneeling down can change a lot." The following week was a whirlwind. Word about the community center spread through whispers and small notes pinned on bulletin boards. Volunteers trickled in. An elderly guitarist who hadn't played in years, a group of teenagers eager to paint over graffiti, a mother offering secondhand books. Sandra watched it unfold, astonished. People who hadn't spoken in years stood shoulder to shoulder, sweeping and scrubbing. One afternoon, a shy little boy approached Sandra with a box of crayons. "These are for the art room," he said quietly. "My sister and I don't need them anymore." She crouched down, smiling. "You just made this place brighter," she told him. Keanu watched from across the room, a small smile tugging at his lips. As evening fell, they stood outside the center, looking at the glowing windows. Laughter drifted out, the sound of strangers becoming neighbors again. Clara leaned on her cane, her eyes shimmering. "Your father always believed the world could heal," she said, her voice breaking. "Tonight, I almost believe it too." Keanu slipped his hands into his pockets, looking up at the stars barely visible through the city haze. "Small acts," he murmured, "can start big revolutions." Sandra glanced at him, her heart full in a way she hadn't expected. She knew tomorrow would bring new obstacles, funding issues, setbacks, maybe even criticism. But tonight, with her mother smiling and the community center alive again, she believed something powerful had begun. In the distance, a church bell rang, the sound carrying through the cool night air. And somewhere deep inside, Sandra felt a shift, a quiet certainty that kindness, once set in motion, could outlast even the darkest storms. The morning of the community center's reopening felt like the city itself had paused to listen. The sky was painted in soft pastels, and the streets outside seemed unusually quiet, as though even the traffic knew something important was about to happen. Sandra woke early, her stomach fluttering with nervous energy. When she stepped into the main hall, she was stunned. The dusty, broken place they had cleaned was now alive. The walls had been painted bright, mismatched chairs lined the edges, and strings of borrowed lights hung from the ceiling. Neighbors who had barely nodded at each other before were now laughing, arranging tables, and placing homemade dishes on a long buffet. Clara sat near the entrance, her shawl freshly washed, her face glowing with a fragile but undeniable joy. She looked healthier than she had in months. "Your father would be proud," she whispered as Sandra knelt beside her. Sandra squeezed her mother's hand, tears already threatening. "We couldn't have done this without him," she said, glancing toward the corner where Keanu was adjusting a speaker wire. He wasn't acting like a celebrity or a savior. He was just another pair of hands, working quietly, smiling at anyone who met his eyes. As guests began to arrive, a small group of children entered, carrying a banner they had painted. "This place is ours again." Their voices rang out in laughter, and for a moment the hall seemed to breathe. Sandra noticed Frank, the janitor, leaning against a broom with a grin that reached his eyes. The shy teenage artist from the botanical garden showed up too, clutching her sketchbook, and even the young couple from the bookstore wandered in holding hands, a shy peace between them. Just as the music started, a sudden flicker of lights dimmed the room. A murmur of worry passed through the crowd, but then the light steadied. Keanu glanced toward Sandra with a small, reassuring nod. Moments later, a heavy storm rolled outside, rain lashing against the windows. Thunder growled, shaking the walls. The sudden downpour threatened to keep guests away, but instead, it pulled them closer. People moved tables inward, gathering around shared plates and stories. Children sat cross-legged on the floor, while the elderly guitarist strummed a soft tune that blended with the sound of rain. In the middle of the evening, Clara surprised everyone by asking for silence. She stood slowly, leaning on her cane. The room stilled as she spoke. "We thought we were alone," she began, her voice trembling but strong. "We thought the world had forgotten us. But kindness found its way back here, through a phone call, through hands that didn't have to help but did anyway." Her eyes met Keanu's and she whispered, "Thank you for keeping a promise my husband made long ago." Keanu looked down, humbled. "It wasn't just me," he said quietly. "It was everyone who chose to show up." Then Frank stepped forward with something cradled in his hands, a small wooden box, weathered but polished. "Your dad left this in the office years ago," Frank said, handing it to Sandra. Inside were photographs, her father smiling beside neighbors, children holding up painted crafts, a younger Clara laughing with flour on her cheeks. Beneath the photos was a folded note. "If this place ever falls quiet, fill it with laughter again." Sandra pressed the note to her chest, tears slipping silently down her face. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed outside. The storm had knocked down a power line nearby, and the building flickered into darkness. Gasps filled the room. Before panic could rise, a beam of soft light swept across the hall. The shy teenage artist had pulled out her phone flashlight, followed by others. Soon, dozens of small lights illuminated the room like fireflies. The guitarist began to play again, and children giggled, their shadows dancing on the walls. Keanu walked to the center of the room, his voice calm and steady. "Storms can take our lights," he said, "but they can't take what we carry inside us." As the rain eased, the power returned, flooding the room with warm light. Cheers erupted, echoing off the newly painted walls. Sandra looked around, realizing the storm hadn't ruined their night. It had made it unforgettable. Later, when most guests had gone, Sandra, Clara, Keanu, and Frank sat quietly among the empty chairs and crumbs of celebration. Outside, the city was washed clean by the rain. Keanu broke the silence first. "You don't need me here forever," he said gently. "This was always yours to build." Sandra felt a pang of sadness at the thought of him leaving, but she understood. "You changed everything," she whispered. Keanu shook his head. "No," he replied. "Your mother made a call. Your father made a promise. Your neighbors chose to show up. I just answered." Before he left, Keanu placed the napkin with his original sketch on the community center's bulletin board. "This is just the beginning," he said. "Keep dreaming bigger." Clara hugged him, her frail arms surprisingly strong. "The world is still good because of people like you," she said softly. As Keanu walked into the misty night, Sandra stood in the doorway, watching him disappear into the city streets. She felt no despair, only gratitude and a deep, steady hope. She turned back toward the glowing center, where laughter still echoed faintly in the halls. Weeks later, the community center was thriving, children painting murals, neighbors sharing meals, strangers becoming friends. Sandra sometimes found herself standing by the entrance, watching the life unfolding inside, and she would think of her father's words, "Kindness can lift anything." She would smile, knowing that a simple phone call and one man's quiet presence had reminded them all of what mattered. The world outside remained imperfect. Bills still came. Storms still rolled through, but something had changed forever. In a small corner of the city, under flickering lights and hand-painted banners, kindness had built a home again.